Here's a question that sounds simple but isn't. What did you do when you were bored as a kid? If you're under 25, the honest answer probably involves a screen: a phone, a tablet, a laptop, YouTube, TikTok, a group chat. Boredom, for most people today, is a problem that gets solved in about 4 seconds. But if you grew up before the mid 90s, or in a household that came to the internet late, boredom looked completely different. It was this long, open, slightly uncomfortable stretch of time with no obvious exit. You might have stared at the ceiling, made up a game with a stick and a rock, rearranged your room for the third time that month, called a friend on a landline and talked for 2 hours about nothing. Or you just sat there, thinking, going nowhere in particular. And here's what nobody talks about: that boredom was building something. Not just character in the vague, inspirational poster sense, actual neurological infrastructure, the kind of cognitive architecture that the internet age, for all its extraordinary gifts, is quietly making harder to develop. Today, we're going to dig into what was really happening inside the brains of kids who grew up offline, and what it means for the adults they became. Let's start with the most counterintuitive thing neuroscience has told us in the last 2 decades. Boredom is productive. Not theoretically, not as a self-help platitude, actually measurably, neurologically productive. When your brain isn't engaged with an external task, it doesn't go idle. It switches into what researchers call the default mode network. This is a set of brain regions that activates during rest, daydreaming, and mind wandering. And what the default mode network does, among other things, is process emotion, consolidate memory, generate creative insight, and build your sense of self. It's the part of your brain that takes all the raw experience of your day and quietly asks, what does this mean? Who am I? What do I actually want? Children who grew up without the internet were forced, repeatedly, to enter this state. Not because their parents were wise about neuroscience, but simply because there was nothing else to do. The absence of constant stimulation was, paradoxically, one of the most cognitively enriching features of that childhood. Compare that to a childhood where every moment of potential boredom is immediately filled by a notification, an autoplay video, a scroll, and you start to see the gap. The default mode network needs silence and space to do its job. And silence, for the first generation of truly online children, has become one of the rarest experiences there is. Let me paint you a picture of what it was like to have a question before Google existed. You wanted to know how volcanoes work, or who invented the telephone, or what the capital of Mongolia was. You had options, none of them instant. You could ask someone, an adult, a teacher, an older sibling, and wait for their answer, which might be incomplete, or wrong, or lead to an argument. You could go to the library. You could find the right volume of an encyclopedia, if your family had one, and flip through it hoping the information was in there. And often, in the process of looking for what you wanted, you found 3 other things you weren't looking for, and some of them turned out to be more interesting than what you started with. This is what researchers call incidental learning, the acquisition of knowledge through tangential exposure, and it built a very particular kind of mind. A mind comfortable with incompleteness, with not knowing, with the slow accumulation of understanding. A mind that had practiced the experience of holding a question open, turning it over, living with it for a while before getting an answer. That tolerance for ambiguity, it turns out, is one of the strongest predictors of creative thinking. It's also, according to psychologist Ari Kruglansky's research on cognitive closure, a buffer against anxiety. People who can tolerate not knowing tend to be more resilient, more open to nuance, and less vulnerable to the kind of binary, all-or-nothing thinking that thrives in environments of information overload. The pre-internet mind was, by necessity, trained in patience. And patience is not just a virtue, it's a cognitive skill. Here's where things get really interesting. Because the internet didn't just change how people accessed information, it fundamentally changed how people learned to be human around other humans. Before social media, before texting, before the ability to curate your identity online, Children and teenagers navigated social reality in real time, with no edits, no filters, no delete button. You said something embarrassing in front of your entire class, and you had to sit in that classroom the next day and the day after that and figure out, through awkward lived experience, how to recover. You had a fight with your best friend and you couldn't ghost them because you'd see them at school on Monday and you'd have to resolve it, or learn to carry the discomfort, or let the friendship die. All of which taught you something. Psychologists studying social development have noted that what offline childhood provided was essentially an unmediated social laboratory. The feedback was immediate and often brutal and entirely unedited. And while that was sometimes genuinely painful, it was also deeply instructive. You developed what developmental psychologist Diana Baumrind might describe as social resilience, the capacity to navigate conflict, read nonverbal cues, repair relationships, tolerate rejection, not because you were taught these skills, but because your environment demanded them over and over again. There's a reason that many psychologists who work with young adults today note higher rates of social anxiety, difficulty with in-person conflict resolution, and what some researchers describe as fragility around face-to-face interaction. None of that is a character failing, it's a training deficit. When the lab is replaced by a screen, the experiments change. There's something more philosophical here, and I want to sit with it for a moment. People who grew up without the internet often describe their childhood as feeling longer. Not longer in a boring, nothing happened way, but longer in the sense of being textured, layered, full. Summer felt like it lasted 3 years. A single afternoon could contain entire worlds. And there's a neurological explanation for this. When your brain is constantly exposed to novelty, the perpetual scroll, the endless new, it stops encoding individual experiences as distinct. They blur. Memory researchers have found that time feels compressed when we're exposed to too much undifferentiated stimulation. Conversely, time feels expansive when we're fully present, deeply engaged, or experiencing something genuinely novel in a slow way. This is why a single, deeply absorbed afternoon as a child can feel, in memory, richer than an entire month of adulthood spent online. The pre-internet generation was, in a very real sense, living in slower time. Not because the world was slower, but because their nervous systems weren't being asked to process 100 micro-inputs per minute. Each thing got more space, more depth, more memory trace. Now, I want to be careful here because this could easily turn into the kind of generational complaint that accomplishes nothing. "Things were better in my day" is the oldest sentence in human history, and it's almost always at least partially wrong. The internet is not the enemy of psychological health. It has given us access, connection, community, and knowledge at a scale that would have been genuinely miraculous to any previous generation. People who grew up online have developed cognitive and social skills that are genuinely different. They navigate digital complexity with fluency that their offline predecessors find genuinely impressive. The speed of thought required to thrive in online environments is its own kind of intelligence. But if you grew up without the internet, here's what I'd invite you to recognize. The things that sometimes feel like disadvantages, your discomfort with constant stimulation, your tendency to want to think things through before responding, your slightly awkward relationship with social media's highlight reel, those aren't bugs. They're features of a mind that was trained in depth rather than breadth, in patience rather than speed, in presence rather than performance. You carry a kind of cognitive inheritance that is, right now, genuinely rare. The ability to be bored without panic, the tolerance for not knowing, the reflex to look up, make eye contact, be in the room. These things are not small. I want to end with this. There's a generation of children growing up right now who will never know what it was like to hold a question open overnight, who will never rearrange their room out of sheer uncurated boredom, who will never have the experience of looking up one thing and accidentally learning something completely different that changed the direction of their thinking. That's not their fault, and it's not their parents' fault. It's just the shape of the world they were handed. But if you're someone who remembers life before the internet, who can still feel in your body what it was like to wait, to not know, to be alone with your thoughts without anxiety, then you carry something worth understanding, worth naming, maybe even worth protecting. Because the most radical thing you can do in an age of infinite stimulation is occasionally put the phone down, stare at the ceiling, and let your brain wander somewhere without a destination. It knew how to do that once. It probably still does. Drop a comment. I'm genuinely curious. What's the one memory from your offline childhood that you find yourself going back to? And if you're new here, stick around. We explore the psychology of everyday life every week, the stuff that shapes us quietly underneath everything. See you next time.